Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Today's episode briefly mentions the sexual assault of minors. While not graphic, if you find that topic distressing, please use discretion. On September 10, 1999, a 17-year-old girl named Jessica Dishon disappeared from her driveway in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. The local sheriff's department bungled the case from the very beginning when a rookie deputy called the lead detective in the department to come to the scene, and he refused, saying Jessica was just a runaway. Girls who run don't tend to leave their car, purse, and one shoe behind. It was a crime scene, but it wasn't treated as such for days. Jessica's battered body was found 2.5 weeks later in a ditch about 7 miles away. By the following month, the police had zeroed in on a suspect, Jessica's next-door neighbor, David "Bucky" Brooks. Though they had no direct evidence against him, they pursued him with vigorous tunnel vision, and the neighboring families began feuding. They took Bucky to trial in early 2003, but it ended in a mistrial when the same detective who had refused to come to the scene that day made an error on the stand that was either idiotic or manipulative, as the case was going badly. 10 years later, a tip would lead to Jessica's real killer, and he was even closer to home than a neighbor. It was a pedophile uncle who had once lived with her family. Though he denies killing her, he took an Alford plea and is in jail today. He was offered the deal pretty quickly because of mishandled evidence and the specter of a previous suspect. It would have been a difficult case to try. With a 20-year sentence for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a 17-year-old, this is a perfect example of the old saying, justice delayed is justice denied. Welcome to episode 53. The Disappearance and Murder of Jessica Dishon. Shepherdsville, Kentucky is located about 20 miles south of downtown Louisville on the banks of the Salt River. It serves as the county seat of Bullitt County, and with a surprising population of over 12,000 people for a town that's only 10 square miles or 16 kilometers. Native Americans inhabited the area for some 15,000 years before surveyor Captain Thomas Bullitt discovered the salt licks in 1773. This made the area home to Kentucky's first commercial salt works. The salt mines brought work of all kinds for settlers, wood choppers, hunters, carpenters, coopers, and of course many merchants and traders soon followed. Salt making was very profitable in the days when settlers had to travel hundreds of miles to buy meat preservatives. Once the Bullitt Lick mines were in production, salt was shipped by flatboat, canoe, and later by trains all over the country. Shepherdsville actually developed around the mill and store built along the Salt River by a man named Adam Shepherd, who had bought 900 acres in the area in the late 1700s. A prosperous businessman, Shepherd came from Baltimore. In addition to making salt, he owned an ironworks in Tennessee and a brokerage firm in New Orleans. The city was chartered in 1793 and was named county seat of Bullitt when it was formed in 1796. The salt mines were closed down in the 1830s due to high competition from Virginia. But in 1836, a mineral springs water spa called Paraquet Springs was founded. People with all kinds of illnesses traveled to Shepherdsville from all over to drink and bathe in the water, usually during the hot summer months. By the mid-1850s, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad's main line was constructed close to the town. A railroad bridge over the Salt River made it a target for sabotage during the Civil War, so it was heavily guarded by Union troops. But during the Christmas raid of 1862, Confederate troops, led by General John Hunt Morgan, destroyed the railroad bridge over the Salt River. Shepherdsville's city webpage states that many men in Bullitt County fought for both sides. That's not unusual for a border state like Kentucky. The Paraquet Springs Hotel burned down in 1879, but bottled mineral water was still sold until 1915. After that, the local economy was based mainly in agriculture. In the 1950s, the Kentucky Turnpike was constructed from Louisville to Elizabethtown with a full interchange and toll booth in Shepherdsville. The 40,000-foot Paraquet Springs Conference Center replaced the old hotel and is situated nicely near the interchange to generate business. With easier access to Louisville, more people moved to the area and new businesses and small industries grew. Today, the same as 20 years ago, Shepherdsville is about 97% white and about 15% of the population lives below the poverty line. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982. Her parents were Michael, or Mike, and Edna, and she had two little brothers, Michael Jr., who was 13 years old, and Christopher, who was 12. She was a senior at Bullitt Central High School. She had been a member of the ROTC, or Reserve Officers Training Corps, until the fall of her senior year, when she decided she just wanted to do other things, her Sergeant Jimmy Bell said. She had also served in the Female Color Guard her first 2 years in ROTC. She quit the Color Guard to get a job. She wanted a car, and dropping out of ROTC her senior year feels natural if she wasn't going to go into a career in the service. She already worked during all of her free time. Your senior year is for dances, end-of-school parties, working and saving money for college. Jessica wanted to attend culinary school. Her brother Michael said she loved to cook for the family, though he joked that her experiments weren't always edible. He also said she was very protective and a loving older sister. At Bullitt Central High, she was known as a good student with good grades and attendance. Her manager at her part-time job at Hardee's said she was a hard worker with excellent attendance. Everyone who knew her trusted her and depended on her. Sergeant Bell put her in charge of the ROTC equipment room. She was responsible for $100,000 worth of equipment, and I trusted her completely, he said. Her friends remember a happy, positive girl, a normal teenage girl obsessed with butterflies and her new car. And she had a new boyfriend. Her life was going somewhere. She didn't intend to stay in small-town Shepherdsville. She was happy, ambitious, smart, and determined. Her young life was full of possibility. And then it was snatched away. I'm going to pause now for a quick commercial break. On September 10th, 1999, 17-year-old Jessica Dishon's alarm went off at 6:45 a.m. She always left for school by 7:15, at which time both of her parents were already gone to work and her little brothers had already taken the bus to school. She drove her prized red Pontiac to school every day. It was parked out in front in the driveway of their house on Deatsville Road. When her mom got home from work at 1:30 p.m., she saw that Jessica's car was still in the driveway. Looking inside, she saw that her purse and backpack were in the back seat, but Jessica's keys were in the floorboard, and she found her cell phone and one shoe on the passenger seat. Immediately alarmed, Edna called her husband, and the family sprung into action, first making calls and searching on their own, and then calling the sheriff's department. A rookie deputy, on the force just 7 months, showed up. His name was David Greenwell, and he had a special volunteer deputy with him. Though inexperienced, he had a bad feeling about the scene right away. He called the senior detective at the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department, a man named Charles Mann, a 13-year veteran detective with a small force. Mann had just gotten off work for the day, and it was Friday evening. He brushed Greenwell off, saying Jessica was just a runaway and would turn up. David Greenwell would later testify that he called Mann twice, and both times he refused. Mann would testify defending himself, saying that the area had many teen runaways, and, quote, there was no sense coming out if I didn't have to. It may be true that there are a lot of teenage runaways, but they don't tend to leave behind their cars, purses, and cell phones. And the one shoe left in the car was very unsettling. This was a crime scene, and Greenwell knew it. He did the best he could, taking pictures on his own, and started questioning friends and family. A civilian search team was already looking for Jessica, and by Saturday morning, her frustrated parents called the FBI. The County Disaster and Emergency Services jumped into action helping with the search that weekend. And by Monday, the FBI was officially on board, sending agents from Louisville and Paducah to join the search, and the Sheriff's Department was finally treating this as an abduction. Jessica's car was not cordoned off as a crime scene until Monday. By then, friends, family, neighbors, and bystanders had been all over it. A television journalist had actually broadcast live from inside the car. The potential for fingerprints or other trace evidence was already compromised. And everyone, even regular people who just watch Dateline, know that the first 48 hours are critical in an abduction. Finally, 72 hours later, law enforcement decided to take the case seriously. Detective Charles Mann's refusal to come to the crime scene when called that Friday evening was the first in a series of devastating mistakes that would cripple the investigation. When crime scene investigators did examine the car, they found a piece of plastic broken off of the driver's seat, and they saw that her cell phone had one number dialed into it before it was dropped on the seat, number 9. She was probably trying to call 911 when she was dragged from her car, losing her shoe, breaking her seat, and dropping her keys. Jessica had fought her kidnapper. On September 21st, 11 days after she went missing, the FBI announced a $10,000 reward to go along with the over $8,000 her family had raised for information leading to the whereabouts of Jessica Dishon. But it would be 17 days before Jessica's battered body was found in a ditch in Salt River Bottoms. It ran along Greenwell Ford Road and was a dumping ground for trash and stolen vehicles. Her friend, Karen Hobbs, found the body. She was partially clothed, and her gold rings and chains were found near her body. Jessica had been struck in the face with enough force to break her jaw. She was severely beaten, but the cause of death was strangulation. After 17 days, decomposition had already taken its toll, making it impossible to identify Jessica by sight. Dental records would prove it was her as they waited for DNA results. Autopsy records show that one of her feet was missing, and several fingers had been severed off. She had likely been held at least a day, maybe 2, and was violently raped and tortured. The investigators also determined that her body had been moved. She was dragged about 15 feet from where she was originally dumped to a place that she could be seen from the road. Whoever had done this wanted Jessica found. That made the crime seem more personal. As law enforcement and the coroner were still working, a prayer vigil was held on Wednesday, September 29th, and about 150 of Jessica's friends showed up to the Cedar Grove Methodist Church. The small community was in shock. Shepherdsville wasn't the type of place where these things happened. It was a tight-knit small town with good, God-fearing Christian people. People just didn't get murdered in Shepherdsville. Vigils for Jessica would become twice-yearly events on September 10th, the anniversary of her disappearance, and May 2nd, her birthday. As the years dragged on, her friends, family, and community refused to forget or move on. Jessica's funeral was held on October 2nd at the Methodist Church, and she was laid to rest in the Cedar Grove Cemetery. By then, law enforcement had zeroed in on a suspect. David Bucky Brooks lived next door to the Dishons on his family's farm. The families were friendly, actually distantly related by marriage, and even played softball together. Bucky had been working with his father that day, and it was his statement that put him under suspicion. He claimed he and his dad drove past Jessica that morning and saw her at her car. So the FBI deduced that he was the last to see her alive. And agent in charge, Jeffrey Lipinski, had already spoke to the press and said it was unlikely that Jessica was kidnapped from someone outside the area. So they were looking at people close to Jessica. Her neighbor Bucky, with an IQ low enough to be considered a learning disability, was an easy target. In his interview, Bucky got flustered and changed his story around. But we all know how these so-called interviews go. They are interrogations, and a man like Bucky Brooks would be easy to confuse and fluster. Bucky had 2 brothers, Joseph, who went by Tommy, and Herbert. They were a tight-knit clan, with everyone working for the family business. Bucky was 41 years old, born in October of 1958. And his family had denied police permission to search their farm, vehicles, or outbuildings while Jessica was missing. I haven't seen an official explanation for this. Maybe they had things they didn't want the police to find. Maybe they just insisted on a search warrant, as was their right. But that refusal kicked off a bad blood war between the 2 families. Accusations started flying, and Bucky and Tommy, instead of trying to make peace, went on the aggressive. They started making harassing phone calls to Jessica's family, even cousins. Back off or else phone calls. Which got the brothers charged with harassment and stalking on October 23, 1999, less than a month after Jessica had been found. By January of 2000, Bucky spent 30 days in jail for violating a judge's order to stay 1,000 feet away from the family and have no contact. But being next-door neighbors, he didn't actually physically break the rule, but the Dishons reported he gestured and tried to talk to them. By August 2000, Bucky had been banned from Bullitt County. Now, I understand how bad this looks, and it does explain some of the tunnel vision. But I feel I need to put it into perspective. The Brooks family had lived next door to the Dishons for years. Being treated like suspects probably stung and felt like a betrayal. And the Dishons, in their grief and worry, would never understand why the Brooks family would not consent to a search of their property. If they were their friends, why didn't they just allow the search? As I said before, maybe there was something illegal on the property, but if there was, nothing was ever found. Jessica wasn't there, nor was there any sign of her. But the damage was done. The Dishons now focused their anger on the Brooks, and the Brooks brothers, Bucky and Tommy, evidently felt that they needed to strike back. It's not how I would have handled it, or you, or most people. But clannish families like this are proud, and were insulted that the Dishons, their friends and neighbors, would suspect them. Of course, the Dishons had their reasons. Bucky, Tommy, and Herbert Brooks were ordered to give hair and blood samples on October 29, 1999. And of the 63 pieces of evidence found on or near Jessica's body, only one item had unknown male DNA on it. By the end of December 1999, the FBI took the hairs and blood samples for DNA testing that would take months. Almost a year, actually. The Commonwealth attorney received the results on November 30th, 2000. During that time, there had been some red herrings and further confusion in the case. There had been over 24 supposed sightings of Jessica before, on, and after the day she disappeared. Some were strangers who said they recognized her picture from the news. Others were actually friends and family. Even though law enforcement took these interviews, they still believed they had their man. Bucky Brooks was the prime suspect. And a grand jury indicted him on January 19, 2001. It took 16 days and 20 witnesses, but he was indicted for the kidnapping and murder of Jessica Dishon, as well as with tampering with evidence and complicity. Tommy Brooks was indicted for tampering with evidence and complicity soon after this. Jessica's parents remember the agony of sitting in the smoke-filled halls of the county courthouse for days waiting for this decision. Now they had it, and Bucky Brooks was going to trial. What they didn't know was that the Bullitt County Commonwealth Attorney, Michael Mann, already knew that the DNA was not a match. Remember, he had gotten the results back in November. He did not publicly admit that the DNA was not a match for either of the Brooks brothers until March of 2001, but it didn't stop the trial. Mann said, quote, "I don't think the DNA evidence is that important. I'm surprised it took the grand jury that long, but I'm not surprised by the indictments. The evidence was there." So without a DNA match for their suspect, and with a completely circumstantial case, the trial was scheduled for August of 2002. But the trial was pushed back by one of those red herring sightings I told you about. Jessica's friend, Belinda Kyle, said she had seen Jessica the night before she disappeared in a black car. Now that Bucky was going to trial, more people were coming forward with stories of Jessica and a black car. 2 local drug dealers, Jason Dunford and James Coulter, were accused by the defense as a friend of Jessica said she saw them with the 2 men the night before she disappeared. One of the men drove a black Camaro. Judge James Waller had no choice but to postpone the trial while these accusations were investigated. The FBI eventually cleared both Dunford and Coulter. This was in October of 2002. Bucky had sat in jail since January of 2001. After the sightings were put into evidence, Judge Waller rescinded his original no bail order and now ordered bond for $100,000 in cash or $200,000 in property. It didn't matter. The Brooks family didn't have that kind of money. So Bucky stayed in jail. His trial began in January of 2003. It became quickly apparent that the Commonwealth had nothing but circumstantial evidence, and even that was weak. The fact that Bucky rented a carpet cleaning machine on the night Jessica went missing was considered evidence. The Commonwealth also put on a trace evidence expert who said that hairs found in linen from the Brooks farm were similar in color and texture to Jessica's hair. That is not identification or direct evidence. In fact, hair analysis is largely considered junk science today. And that was pretty much the Commonwealth's case, aside from Bucky's disjointed interrogation and his phone harassment of the Dishons. Again, the phone harassment looked bad, but it wasn't direct evidence that he had actually harmed Jessica. And years later, it can be viewed as a reaction to the bad blood created between the two families by law enforcement, who should have gotten a damned search warrant instead of just asking for permission. Bucky's defense attorneys were public defender Vince Eustace and a lawyer working pro bono named John Spainhour, a Brooks family friend. Spainhour said, quote, "I have known Bucky for years and have never known him to be violent or even yell at people. He doesn't have a violent bone in his body. He is just a guy trying to do the best he can with what he has." Eustace and Spainhour put on a hell of a defense. They had a Bullitt Central High School resource officer testify who happened to be a former sheriff's deputy. He said he had passed along many tips to the police that were never followed up on. Another detective on the case, Jim Adams, had left the sheriff's department and testified to mishandling of evidence and other issues. The rookie deputy, first on scene, Michael Greenwell, also testified. The photos he took and all his interviews were missing from the case file. Adams said the same thing happened with his part of the investigation. By the time they got to trial, there wasn't one piece of paper that even had his name on it, even though he had been one of the lead detectives. Detective Jim Adams had left the force just 4 months after Bucky was indicted. He said in large part in response to the Dishon investigation. He said at the time he left, there was not enough evidence to charge Bucky, but, quote, "I don't think they looked at anybody else after I left." He admitted that investigating the Brooks family, since they were neighbors, had been a good place to start, but there were just too many inconsistencies and no direct evidence. As you can imagine, this testimony from the detective and deputy was extremely devastating to the Commonwealth's case. They had no choice but to put Detective Charles Mann on the stand for damage control, the detective who had refused to come to the scene the day Jessica disappeared. He did not make a great witness. He was on the defensive for mistakes he and his department had made, and while on the stand, he made another huge one. When asked why he focused so singularly on Bucky Brooks, Detective Mann stated that Bucky had failed a lie detector test given by the FBI. Again, anyone who just casually watches Law & Order or Dateline knows that polygraph examinations are not admissible in court. A detective would damn well know this. Judge Waller had no choice but to declare a mistrial on January 28, 2003, and Detective Mann was investigated to see if he made this error on purpose. Brooks' attorneys charged that his error was blatant and deliberate. He swore it wasn't, that he wasn't aware he couldn't say that in court, and that he wasn't properly prepared by the prosecutor. I call bullshit. Their case was quickly going down the drain. They had no physical evidence, no witnesses, and what little circumstantial evidence they had was very weak. And the defense had scored many points illustrating the complete bungling of the investigation by the Sheriff's Department and even the FBI from day one. No, I think it was a calculated move on Mann's part. A mistrial was better than an acquittal. If Bucky was found innocent, double jeopardy would attach, and it would be over. Charles Mann had been demoted back to a deputy and now faced his own hearing for misconduct. He could pay up to $500 in fines and serve 6 months in jail. But Judge Waller found him not guilty. As irresponsible as it was, Mann's insistence that he didn't know and wasn't prepared seemed credible to the judge. Though the judge agreed that even just people who watch TV would know that what he did was, quote, a no-no. But finally, Bucky was released on bond on February 28th of 2003 after sitting in jail for over 2 years. When he was released, Bucky said, "I'm shocked. I spent 25 months in jail and I didn't think this was ever going to happen. I feel sorry for the Dishon family for losing their daughter, and if it was my child, I would be upset too." 2 years in jail had softened Bucky's stance toward his old neighbors. But his second trial was scheduled for November of 2003. The Commonwealth was refusing to back down. And then suddenly, in September, at a pretrial hearing, Commonwealth Attorney Michael Mann surprised the court and public by asking that all charges be dismissed. This was an evidentiary hearing, and Bucky's defense attorneys had just scored another hit. The Brooks farm had been searched without a warrant 3 times. The police had never bothered to get one, so the hair evidence, which was shaky at best, was out. Michael Mann saw the writing on the wall and asked for the charges to be dropped. Judge Waller dismissed the charges without prejudice, meaning they could recharge Bucky when and if they found more evidence. Mann told the press that he didn't find the evidence sufficient at that point to get a conviction. Public perception was that Bullitt County officials had screwed up, and that Bucky Brooks was going to get away with murder. The town turned against Bucky and his family, to the point that jurors from his trial began giving interviews to the press. 5 jurors met with Jason Riley of the Courier-Journal to express their outrage. Juror Ann Rigney said about Bucky, there was nothing linking him. All the Commonwealth did was prove that she was dead. They were particularly upset that Bucky had sat in jail for over 2 years with no real evidence, and as jurors, they were in a unique position to give honest interviews to the public about what went on in court. Juror John Stover said, he can't get those 2 years back. He should get some kind of restitution. They stole 2 years of this man's life. They criticized the sheriff's department's handling of the case and worried that the real killer would never be found. Juror Janice Presley said, quote, the disgusting part is that nobody's getting punished for their inadequacies. Many other mistakes had come to light in trial, like the fact that the sheriff stored all of the evidence in the case in a storage unit that wasn't temperature controlled. It came out that the police had preserved a piece of Jessica's thigh muscle, but left it in the storage unit. There had also been a lot of talk about a rope tied to Jessica's leg. The Commonwealth tried to show a piece of rope found at the Brooks farm as a connection, but the jury said it was weak. There was no way to prove it was the same rope. And aside from that, they had no other physical evidence. These jurors said that the whole jury had unanimously agreed afterwards that they would indeed have voted to acquit. A young girl was dead, and a family would probably never get answers. To this, juror John Stover ominously said, quote, don't die in Bullitt County. With all the public criticism, Sheriff Paul Parsley started making public comments. He said, my officers open hundreds of cases a year. They are underpaid and overworked. My officers are certainly as good as any officers in the state. But he also came under fire for his own leadership, and to that he said, I trusted my people and let them do the investigation. In hindsight, I certainly wish I had had more control. He did have control. He chose not to be involved in the investigation. This comment is a shitty way of passing the buck back on his own staff. Leadership is paramount in almost any profession, but most certainly in a sheriff's department. If this is what Detective Charles Mann had as an example, it's not all that surprising he didn't feel like going to a crime scene on his evening off. Small-town cops often have a reputation as lazy good old boys. The Bullitt County Sheriff's Department didn't do much to dispel that cliché in this case. Former Detective Jim Adams also spoke to the press, even though his testimony had been particularly damning to the Commonwealth's case. While he did leave in part over the Dishon investigation, he echoed the sheriff's frustrations about underfunding, understaffing, not the right or enough equipment, and inadequate training. He felt that most detectives and deputies were hardworking, conscientious men, but they were not given enough resources to do their jobs effectively. This was all cold comfort to the Dishon family. Now that Bucky Brooks was free, the case had officially gone cold. Cousin to the family, Donna Mattingly, told the press, quote, they're just numb right now. They don't know what to say. We want justice for Jessica, but I don't know if that will ever happen because everything is so messed up. Nothing has ever been done right in this case. And she was right about that. The police had received a tip from an anonymous family member very early in the investigation before Bucky was ever arrested. The tipster said they should look at Jessica's Uncle Stanley, her father's brother. This tip was never followed up on, even though Stanley Dishon had behaved very strangely around the time of Jessica's murder. I'm going to pause now for a word from our sponsors. After the charges against Bucky Brooks were dismissed, the case really did go cold. Officials didn't seem concerned with investigating anymore. I think they still believed they had their man and didn't see why they should keep looking. In 2005, Detective Charles Mann passed away. Detective Jim Adams had already left the force, so not many of the original players were still involved. Sadly, both of Bucky's parents had passed away by 2010, never getting to see their son's name fully cleared. And also, in 2009, Jessica's parents, Mike and Edna Dishon, had divorced. This isn't uncommon for parents of murdered children, particularly in cold cases, but it's another sad footnote in this tragedy. However, things took a turn when in 2010, rookie deputy David Greenwell ran and was elected sheriff of Bullitt County. He had been the only deputy to take Jessica's case seriously from the beginning, and now he was in charge. In 2013, he managed to hire 2 very experienced cold case detectives out of Louisville Metro Police Department, Detective Lynn Hunt and Detective Gary Huffman. Hunt actually came out of retirement to come work in Bullitt County. Just a few months on the job, the detectives received a tip in late summer 2013 that 2 inmates who had served time with Stanley Dishon wanted to talk. Prisoners X and Y, as known in the press, had served with Stanley at the Kentucky State Reformatory near LaGrange from 2011 to early 2013, and they said he confessed to murdering his niece to them. He told them he had been arguing with Jessica, chasing her around the yard, and then, quote, strangled that little bitch. He told them about dismembering her foot and keeping some of her clothes. These things had been left out of the original press reports and was a good indicator that the prisoners were telling the truth. Also, for the record, they did not get any time shaved off of their sentences or any other kind of favors for coming forward. They just wanted to do what was right. So Hunt and Huffman started looking hard at Stanley Dishon. Born in September of 1958, he was 41 at the time of the murder in 1999. In 2002, his wife Carol Ann Walters divorced him after she caught him molesting her daughters. One was his stepdaughter, the other his natural daughter. In 2003, he was convicted of molesting his daughters and a niece, all under the age of 10. He took an Alford plea, which means he claims he is innocent but believes there's enough evidence for him to be convicted. He was serving a 10-year sentence when he met the Good Samaritans prisoners X and Y. Detective Lynn Hunt started looking hard at Stanley's past. She found out that before his marriage, he often lived off relatives. And it would come out later, he was a serial pedophile within his own family, abusing many of the children in the homes he was allowed to stay in. He had lived with his brother, Mike Dishon, and family from 1989 to 1996. Prisoner X and Y also revealed Stanley's motive. He had been sexually abusing Jessica for years, but she had a new boyfriend and was resisting him. He was jealous, and she also told him if he didn't leave her alone, she would tell what he had been doing. He had gone there that morning to confront her about her boyfriend when the fight started. Then he kidnapped her, raped, tortured, and murdered her, his own niece. After receiving these tips, Detective Hunt and Huffman ordered another search of the property where Jessica had been found. In the barn, they found a fitted sheet and pillowcase with what looked like old dried blood on them. They exactly matched the sheets from Jessica's bed. Edna Dishon, now Edna Jett, said she wasn't sure when the sheets went missing. She had left Jessica's bedroom exactly as it was that day. It's unbelievable that the sheets were still in this barn, and another blight on investigators who missed it during their searches. It would seem that Stanley dragged Jessica in the house first to rape her, and then took her to the barn where he held her and tortured her for a couple of days. The prisoners who gave testimony said he bragged about this, specifically about the barn where he had held her. It all fit. When Detective Hunt questioned Stanley's ex-wife, Carol Ann Walters, she said she found it odd investigators never looked at Stanley because he had acted so strangely at the time. She said he had been very nervous and peculiar and rarely slept until her body was found, and that he was obsessed with watching the television reports of her disappearance. Our instincts are to say, why didn't she report this? But he was her husband, and it would be 3 more years before she found out that Stanley was molesting her daughters. Even after Stanley was indicted in October 2013 for Jessica's kidnapping and murder, Mike Dishon had trouble believing his brother was involved. In hindsight, though, he remembered during the search that Stanley claimed to have a premonition that Jessica was buried in the river bottoms. So the family and friend crew went to search there. She wasn't exactly where he indicated, but when she was found about 2 miles down the road, Mike said Stanley vomited and he had to take him home. As Mike drove him home, Stanley told him he thought it was Bucky Brooks who had killed Jessica. He might have been the first one to plant the seeds of bad blood between the neighbors. And while Stanley was being investigated for Jessica's murder, the rape and molestation charges were piling up. In August of 2013, he was indicted for the rape and sodomy of a girl from 1982. She had been 7 years old when the abuse started, and it went on until 1987. She later expressed regret in telling the truth because it had divided her family. Many Dishon relatives were still on Stanley's side, most notably his sister Wanda. In January of 2014, he was charged with deviant sexual intercourse with a male relative under the age of 12 from 1996 and 1997. And he was already serving time for molesting his daughters and another niece. That's 6 family members Stanley Dishon preyed upon. Once the other rape and molestation charges were filed, Mike Dishon no longer believed his brother and withdrew support. In January of 2015, Stanley Dishon was offered a plea deal by the Commonwealth. They would reduce the murder charge to manslaughter and drop the kidnapping and rape charges. Some found it unbelievable and unconscionable that the Commonwealth offered him a deal, but legal experts supported the decision. The complete mishandling of evidence, along with the first trial of Bucky Brooks, would be plenty of reasonable doubt for some juries. It was just safer to offer him a deal. And he took it, another Alford plea, so he technically did not admit guilt. At his sentencing, his male relative that he had sexually abused gave a victim impact statement. He cried while he described the abuse he suffered, and then he said, "I was a kid then, I'm a man now. If I was given 10 minutes alone in a room with you, you wouldn't walk out." Stanley Dishon's other victims testified, including the girl from 1982 who cried and said she wished she had never told because of the grief it caused in her family. It's disgusting how many lives this monster ruined, and after all that, he got just a 20-year sentence. He would be eligible for parole in 16 years, 2031. But he will probably serve his 20 because he will never admit what he did, and admitting guilt and showing remorse are a requisite for parole. Just this past January, 2019, he gave an interview from prison at Kentucky State Penitentiary at Eddyville. He still adamantly denies killing Jessica, though he didn't deny sexually abusing her. He mainly groused that his brother Mike hadn't been to see him. "It bothers me a lot that he ain't come. It bothers me a lot," he said. "I will tell him straight to his face and won't back an inch. I am an innocent man and they are lying on me," he insisted. He claimed that he wanted to go to trial, but was bullied by his defense counsel, who strongly advised him to take the plea deal. Quote, "I was always told to keep my mouth shut and not speak out in court. He said they told him not to say a word or you'll mess it all up. There was nothing I could do." There was nothing you could do because you are guilty. Your attorneys were smart and brokered a more than fair deal for scum like you. You had been unmasked as a serial pedophile in your own family. There might have been reasonable doubt at a murder trial, but you were going to be in prison for a long time anyway. The new Commonwealth attorney, Michael Ferguson, expressed disappointment at making the deal, but he knew how damaged the case would be. Your case is only ever as good as the original investigation. And Jessica's case was egregiously mishandled right from the start. Detective Lynn Hunt agreed, especially in light of the molestation charges against Stanley in 2002. The police should have looked into Stanley then, a close relative who had sexually abused his own daughters. Jessica had been raped. Detective Hunt called this oversight tragic. There are many tragedies in this case. Along with the pain of a 15-year-old cold case, the Dishon marriage broke up, and family members passed away with no resolution. Time marched on, it seemed, for everyone but Bucky Brooks. The town really never forgave him, despite the charges being dropped and Stanley Dishon finally being convicted. Sheriff David Greenwell, remember that first rookie deputy on scene the day Jessica disappeared, led the charge to help Bucky and his family. He said, quote, "I never did think Bucky was guilty. I couldn't step in and say not to charge him because what if he was guilty? But I've watched him. I watched the whole family grow up." He went on to say, "I think the community maybe needs to step in and help them out a little because actually the community has kicked them aside when they thought Bucky was guilty." In the years that had passed, Bucky and his wife Irene had 5 children. One was a special needs child, who needed 3 open-heart surgeries. The community did come together to find them permanent housing, a vehicle, clothing, and even money. And it's not that Bucky didn't want to work. In 2005, he ran into a burning trailer and rescued 4 children and had permanent lung damage, so he was and is on permanent disability. The sheriff's department made a formal apology to the Brooks family, and they said that they forgave them and did not plan to file a lawsuit. I hate to be cynical, but I'm sure some of these donations were made in the spirit of the Brookses not suing Bullitt County. But the ugliness towards the Brooks family has continued. In May of 2016, their home was vandalized twice. Not robbed, but items destroyed, particularly children's toys that had been donated. The tires on his little girl's bike were slashed. In my research, I came across a YouTube video of some so-called Good Samaritans in Bucky's yard. The yard is trashed and the house looks derelict, and evidently this couple had come to clean it up. But instead of being friendly about it, they banged on the door, ordering Bucky to move his car or they would hit it. They were antagonizing him and his family. Irene comes out upset, saying, "Just let me get Mama's angel." And you could see her cross the yard and pick up what looks like a cemetery headstone. Bucky gets angry enough to threaten to get a gun. Meanwhile, this supposedly altruistic couple is laughing and egging him on. They tell him, "Don't worry, if we hit your car, someone will just give you a new one." They weren't there to help. They're probably the type that can't stand driving by a house like that on their perfect little street. And beyond that, they seemed vengeful. Like they wanted to rile up Bucky and his family, sneering at the donations that they have received. Bucky's low IQ is evident in this video, and I would wager he and Irene both have mental disabilities, not to mention PTSD. After Stanley Dishon was convicted, a reporter asked Bucky, quote, "During the trial, a lot was made of your lack of education. Did that hurt your feelings or embarrass you at all?" Bucky said, "No, sir, not really, because half the people in Bullitt County ain't got no education." If you're not viewing Bucky as a murder suspect, he seems painfully naive and definitely appears to have learning disabilities that go beyond just a lack of education. It helps explain his reaction to the Dishon's anger at him and how the fighting started when he was first accused. He was genuinely hurt that his neighbors suspected him. I'm not excusing what he did, the phone calls and harassment. I'm just saying I can see why. And that video I told you about? It's called The Real Bucky Brooks. But if you ask me, it's a better example of the real people of Bullitt County who put on the same blinders their sheriff's department did and almost railroaded an innocent man into prison. And in the years past, they still harass Bucky Brooks. Even though Jessica Dishon's own uncle took a plea and admitted to molesting 6 family members. They should focus their hate on Stanley Dishon where it belongs and let Bucky and his family live in the peace they deserve. It's been 20 years since Bucky was first accused, and he is still treated like a criminal. Ironically, Stanley Dishon is 4 years into his own 20-year sentence. Southern Fried True Crime is written and produced by me, Erica Kelley. The original graphic art is by Coley Horner, and Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio. Special thanks to listener Chelsea Biggers for suggesting this case. Most of my research came from newspapers of the time, particularly the Courier-Journal. Also, the Crime Historian blog covered the case, as she is local to the area. I've mentioned it a couple of times now, but reminder, I'll be back at CrimeCon this year in New Orleans. I really hope some of you can make the trip. I would love to meet you, and I'm looking forward to seeing familiar faces from last year. It's June 7th through the 9th, and if you're interested in going, please use my promo code to purchase your ticket. It's Fried Crime 19. Several of your favorite podcasters will also be in the Big Easy, along with speakers, exhibits, workshops, and everything CrimeCon has to offer. So again, to buy a ticket, don't forget to use my code FriedCrime19. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe, and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm on most large platforms like Stitcher and most other podcatchers. If you're interested in supporting the show, please visit my my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com. There you can sign up to be a patron of the show, make a one-time donation, or purchase show merchandise. That's southernfriedtruecrime.com. If you have any comments, corrections, or suggestions, you can email me at southernfriedtruecrime@gmail.com. I love hearing from you guys, and I'm always looking for new cases, so please feel free to reach out. I am also all over social media. Just search the show name in your favorite platform. If you're interested in discussing this case or any other episodes further, come check out my discussion group. It's linked to my Southern Fried True Crime Facebook page. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.